All right. Welcome back, everybody. We're very happy to begin now with the second panel of today's event. This is Gerald Muller as student and colleague, and this panel has three distinguished panelists, and I will make the introductions at the beginning, and then we will proceed with the presentations. First, we have Stephen Aschheim, who's Professor of History Emeritus at the Hebrew University, where he held the Gavani Chair of European Studies, is the author of many books, primarily in the fields of modern German intellectual history and German Jewish intellectual history. He'll speak to us today from Jerusalem. So Stephen, it's in part because of your presence that we're really very happy to be doing this over Zoom, and thrilled that you can join from overseas. So we have Gerald Izenberg as our second speaker, Professor of History Emeritus at Washington University in St. Louis, a distinguished intellectual historian. His most recent book is Identity, the Necessity of a Modern Idea, published in 2016. And he'll be speaking to us from his home in Toronto, Ontario. And thirdly, we'll have Stephen Whitfield, Professor Emeritus at Brandeis University, where he held the Max Richter Chair in American Civilization. He's the author of many books in the field of American intellectual, cultural, and political history. Most recently, Learning on the Left, Political Profiles of Brandeis University. So Professor Aschheim, let's begin with your presentation. And I'm not sure if I see your box, but would hope that you can sort of unmute yourself and make your video presence felt.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Can you see me?
Not quite, but
yeah.
Now we can. Wonderful.
Now, before I begin, is there any possibility of me being able to see the honoree?
Well,
is there any way I can see Jerry?
It's really up to the honoree, but we'd be very happy
there
to
he
have
is. Okay.
Have him appear.
There he is. Okay. So this is going to be a very different presentation from the presentations we heard before, because they were scholarly, they were erudite, and they were serious. But I am supposed to speak about Gerald Muller, who I met already in 1972, 1973, when he struck me as being this kind of very young, rather precocious fellow who I was teaching at a place that it sounds almost archaic and not PC to mention, but he was a student at what one would call the Institute for Zionist Leaders from Abroad. And he was one of the people in the particular class that I was teaching. And I was used to a certain degree of authority in my classes, almost sure that the people that were listening to me were gulping in each word and looking at me with kind of fervent adoration, until this fellow Muller, almost every lecture I gave, he would pop up and would more or less correct what I'd been saying. And usually, to my chagrin, he was usually correct. So I knew Jerry already as a highly promising, if somewhat disturbing element in my class. And this was already in 1972, 1973. And Jerry, in his always modest way, at the end of the period of teaching, the whole class were kind enough to give me the book by the late and great Walter Laqueur called A History of Zionism. And in that book, each student inscribed their experiences, the degree to which they liked me, the degree to which they would miss me. And I will read to you now, it takes about a half a second, Gerald Muller's contribution to that book. He wrote, "To my favorite Zion." I'm not going to translate that, but that does have a rather different tone and meaning than what you think. Those of you who know Hebrew will know that this is not exactly a compliment to his revered leader. But he wrote, "To my favorite Zion, I hope you enjoyed my presence as much as I did, Jerry Muller." So that gives you a taste as to the reticence, the modesty, the kind of reluctance to push himself forward that I knew Jerry. Now there's something, oh, by the way, I'm not sure, because in the advert to the conference, it's written Dr. Jerry Muller, but it is not, as his books appear, Jerry Z. Muller. Now, I usually call Jerry not Jerry, but by his Z name, seeing he was my student, which is Zucker. Whether or not he's a sugary fellow, a mushy fellow, that's up to you to decide. I'll just tell one other thing. When he was a student of mine, I'm sure all of you or many of you know his better half, Sharon, but it is during this year, you may have thought that Jerry was listening to my lectures, but actually he was probably swooning over Sharon, because that is when their relationship began. And in a rather furtive manner, at one point I managed, when I think we were away, to provide them with our apartment, in which I'm sure discussions revolved purely around Herzl, Nordau, and Dostoevsky. So that was the beginning of our relationship. And I can tell you that although the people in that class were very nice, lovely people, that relationship has gone on ever since. And that's pretty rare for, I think, both of us. It became immediately apparent to me that Jerry was going to be a very serious and distinguished intellectual. And what has characterized over the years, many years, is although we've never Zoomed, I don't quite know why, but we have very, very regular, long transatlantic conversations in which we share ideas, share criticisms, and it is something from which I've profited very much over the years. I have also, I think, at times goaded Jerry to finish a certain manuscript, because in the meantime, he finished 2 or 3 other books, which interested me less than the one which is going to come out, I hope, very soon, the one on Jakob Taubes, which I'm sure is going to be a superb piece of scholarship. So we don't share always the same politics, but perhaps rare for a conservative, perhaps not rare for a conservative. I mean, he's wearing a tie now and I'm wearing a sweater. There's a sartorial element to this relationship. But the one thing that Jerry does, given our very different politics, is I think we both share a lovely sense of humor. And as much as ideas, that bonds us together quite deeply, as do our family relationships. So Jerry, I'm wishing you the very best. I'm hoping that our conversations continue, and perhaps at a later stage, you will politically mature. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for the presentation and for your concluding note of optimism, which is so rare in general at the present moment. Let's turn now to our second presentation from Professor Izenberg.
I should say that there is an odd asymmetrical symmetry about this event for me. 11 years ago, Jerry attended my retirement at Washington University. There's nothing unusual about colleagues attending one another's retirement events, so I didn't expect to be at Jerry's quite so soon. But he also had attended my retirement in a more personal capacity. not just as a colleague, but as a former undergraduate student from my early years teaching at Brandeis University, the first of my students to become a scholar and a teacher in the same field of European intellectual history, and now also as a friend. And though my retirement event was mostly an in-house affair in the history department, I asked him to come because it would not have been complete for me without him.
Hello.
As an undergraduate, Jerry gave me one of the greatest rewards. Steve? Steve? Stephen?
Steve, I think you'll need to mute yourself, Steve. Steve, I think you'll need to mute the.
As an undergraduate, Jerry gave me one of the greatest rewards that a student can give a teacher, and one in which, in fact, reflected more on his own qualities as a student, a mind, and a personality. On his own initiative, he organized a group of 6 or so other students, including, by the way, or not just by the way, a young woman named Sharon Zaks, who most of you know better as Sharon Muller. And he asked me if I would be willing to teach this group on a private basis. The circumstances were unusual. Jerry had taken my course on the intellectual history of Europe in the early 20th century, in the fall of 1974. I'd originally planned a follow-up course in the spring of 75, but I'd been turned down for tenure the previous year, and I was given that spring off as a consolation prize. Jerry asked if I would be willing to give the planned course informally to the group at my home in the evening. Of course, it wouldn't count for credit. They would be working with me over and above their normal course load, and I had many things on my mind that year, not least finding a job. But there was no way I was going to say no. It was impossible to resist the initiative and the eagerness of students whose intelligence and energy and curiosity I already knew from the previous class. That course, which were really just discussions in an informal setting without the pressure of exams and grades, remains one of the best teaching experiences and memories of my career. Everything that Jerry's colleagues know to be true of him today as a scholar, a writer, and a critic were already true of him in budding form as an undergraduate. He was as omnivorous, quick, and penetrating then as he is now. His ability to render concepts clearly and attack them critically, so evident in his books on economics and conservative thought, was extremely useful to a teacher like me, who, because of his consistent readiness to talk, didn't have to work hard to stimulate class discussion. I should say here that those who think of Jerry's work primarily in terms of the history of conservatism and capitalism may have a surprise and certainly a treat in store for them in his forthcoming biography of Jakob Taubes. In addition to its superbly insightful picture of the man, it ranges over the whole of 20th century intellectual history, European intellectual history, and American too, from cultural criticism to political theory to philosophy and the arcana of Christian and Jewish theology, with complete mastery and great readability. I was bowled over by it, but I wasn't surprised. I have never heard Jerry teach, but his ease with the many different genres that intellectual history deals with was obvious when he was a student. Even in the earliest stages of his intellectual life, Jerry could expose weak arguments and specious reasoning with the same analytic acuity and sharp wit that his published work demonstrates. He had occasion enough to exercise those abilities because he was virtually a lone conservative student voice amidst the campus orthodoxy of somewhat vague but passionate 60s era radicalism, certainly in my classes, which inevitably dealt with a great deal of Marxist thought. This was, after all, Brandeis in the early 1970s. I was somewhat surprised by Jerry's conservative position. I had not encountered it before amongst Brandeis students, but what I remember most was the mature confidence and the argumentative skill with which he represented it. Jerry, and I think Steve Aschheim has referred to this in a somewhat different way, was cowed neither by authority nor by majority opinion. You know, when I began thinking about what I was going to say about Jerry for the talk, there echoed in my mind a saying from a tractate from the Mishnah called Ethics of the Fathers that I thought was perfectly appropriate for my experience with them. The line says, or so I thought, Mikol Talmidai Hiskalti, I have learned from all my students. But when I looked it up, I saw that I had remembered it incorrectly. In fact, it says exactly the opposite. It says, Mikol Malamdai Hiskalti, I've learned from all my teachers. And then it struck me how appropriate the two sayings were taken together. How appropriate for my experience with Jerry over the years. Because with the passing of time, Jerry turned from my student to my colleague and not seldom to my teacher. This has been true in more than one area. We've stayed in touch through phone conversations and emails, and I follow Jerry closely on Facebook. Our politics are quite different, but I find that he offers the best reasoned, most powerful version of conservative thinking available today. It was his arguments that I turn to when I want to understand conservative positions at their deepest level, and I'm sometimes even persuaded by them. We're closer to one another in our mutual dismay at the absurdities of the politicization of the humanities in the university, but I very much value his outspoken and acerbically polemical voice on that issue, which is in contrast to my own overgreat reticence. But his most important instruction hasn't been in politics or current events. Though we have worked for the most part in quite different areas of intellectual history, some years ago I asked him to read the not quite finished manuscript of my History of the Concept of Identity before sending it off to a press for consideration. This was a particularly burdensome request because it was a very long manuscript which ventured into many different fields of inquiry. But that was exactly the reason I thought Jerry was the right person to ask. Of course, I had long had respect for his critical acumen, and knowing his intellectual integrity and his personality, I had complete confidence that he would pull no punches with the manuscript. But I also knew that he would be able to check my work for accuracy and soundness of argument in the many different fields into which it chased the concept of identity. And I got exactly the kind of reading that I had hoped for: knowledgeable, sympathetic, and critically helpful. The cliche is absolutely true. It's a better book than it would have been without him. And until I was forced to think about my relationship with Jerry under the rubric of this panel, that is Jerry as student and colleague, I never, through the whole process, reflected on the fact that he had once been my student. It was never anything other than asking a highly respected colleague for his critical assistance. The same felt true in reverse when, no doubt in revenge for my burdening him with the identity book, Jerry asked me last spring to read his lengthy manuscript on Jacob Taubes. Of course, I made critical suggestions and offered advice, but reading it was as much a learning as a critical experience for me. I knew of Taubes through his personal influence on peers of mine, people who had taken classes with him. but it wasn't until Jerry brought him alive through his research and description that I understood his charismatic power. Even more important for me, though, was Jerry's superb analysis of his eclectic ideas and how, by situating Taubes so skillfully in the whole panorama of 20th century European and American intellectual history, he illuminates new facets of it. I don't know how Jerry feels about his retirement. I would guess some mixture of sadness at giving up teaching and happiness at the prospect of undisturbed time for research and writing, though in what proportions, I'm not so sure. I imagine the department colleagues he has served well, and those students who will never have him as a teacher feel mostly sad at his leaving, as they should. As for me, I feel happy for him because this is what he wants, and lucky for myself because I will not be losing him as a colleague. In fact, my current research takes me closer to areas of Jerry's particular expertise, and I've already given him a hint that I look forward to presuming once again on his colleagueship to enlist his critical help with my own writing. Congratulations, Jerry.
Gerald, thanks so much. Let me mention, Jerry, that there's a sort of popular request that you turn your camera on continuously. I think it makes people feel like they can sort of enjoy your responses, especially with these personal tributes, but I think it would be nice if you don't mind just to leave your camera on from this point forward. We'll now turn to Steve Whitfield to speak about Jerry as colleague, I'm going to presume here. Steve, the field is yours.
Okay, Jerry, good to see you again. And I learned so much from the panelists who have spoken so far. Although Jerry arrived as an undergraduate at Brandeis 1 year after I began teaching there, he never enrolled in any of the classes that I taught. Had he or Sharon Sachs done so, that would have been too intimidating an experience to be entirely pleasant. Instead, I first came across his presence on campus when his fellow Canadian, Rabbi Emil Fackenheim, lectured at Brandeis, and Jerry introduced him. The sophistication and precision with which he explained to the audience why that evening's speaker was important and worth listening to impressed me. Not long afterwards, Rabbi Fackenheim spoke at BU, where Jerry's counterpart was the Harvard philosopher Robert Nozick. And at least in my recollection, Jerry's remarks did not suffer by comparison. In the decade of the 1970s, the history profession was being nicked by the fad of psychohistory. And two Brandeis historians in particular, Rudolf Binion in 20th century German history, John Demos in colonial American history, presented their claims at a thought-provoking colloquium, and I have a feeling that Jerry Izenberg was there too, in which Jerry Muller, still a self-assured undergraduate, somehow served as the moderator as well as lion tamer. It was therefore very easy for me to pick up quite early, perhaps the most striking quality that anyone who meets Jerry notices, which is how smart he is. The Phi Beta Kappa chapter at Brandeis perceived that quality too, and the last conversation that I recall having with him while he was still a non-student of mine was at the induction ceremony in the late spring of 1977. The details inevitably escape me, but I know that the topic that engaged Jerry, Sharon, and me, to put it on the most elevated plane, consisted of how to think about personal achievement so that social arrangements not only reward it, but must also be reconciled with democratic inclusiveness and opportunity. Echoes of that conversation lingered earlier this week when I read the list of Brandeis's latest Phi Beta Kappa inductees, who include 1 Fang, 1 Fong, 1 Zhang, 1 Zhu, 1 Lin, 3 Lis, and 3 Lius. Because on this Zoom program, Steve Aschheim, Jerry Izenberg, and I can claim seniority in having enjoyed the earliest encounters with Jerry, because we know the baseline, before he made the transition to the status of professional colleague. I feel entitled to trace the arc of his academic career, to measure on the occasion of his retirement how amply his promise has been fulfilled. Over the course of 4 decades of scholarship, one feature of his books that strikes me as obvious is their variety. Even as he has hugged the shore of his expertise in modern European intellectual and economic history, Jerry has exhibited fluency in several genres of historiography. The dissertation that he revised into his first book, The Other God That Failed, offers so full an account of the career of the conservative sociologist Hans Fryer, as we've learned earlier this afternoon, that the standard of scholarly definitiveness is easily satisfied. This is so thorough a biography that despite the international eminence Fryer once enjoyed, no one will be animated to tackle his life and legacy again. The Other God That Failed also prefigured what I think has characterized Jerry's subsequent career, which is his flair for taking up topics from a fresh angle. And here, again, I repeat what earlier speakers have said. With the biography of Fryer, Jerry did not address the vital but familiar place that totalitarianism of the left has occupied in Western intellectual life for so much of the 20th century, but of course looks to the right. And the forthcoming work that he will be coming out with, that a number of speakers have already mentioned, loops back into the genre of biography, but with a dramatically different figure. Jacob Talbot was part charlatan, part scoundrel, as well as a learned authority on the thought of the part Jew, part Christian St. Paul. Fryer presented no really dicey questions as to character, in sharp contrast to Talbot, who kept bobbing to the surface at academic institutions on 3 continents. And had he lived into our own moment, perhaps only the Me Too movement would have stopped him in his tracks. This biography of Talbot is fair and nuanced enough to allow readers to assess the record as they see fit. And if the criterion by which a book is evaluated is the cogency of its claims and the tautness of its argument, then Adam Smith, in his time and ours, meets that standard compellingly. As so often is the case in the history of ideas, as Ryan has mentioned in particular, Smith's name has been more carelessly invoked than his work has been carefully read. And however ambiguous the shadow that Smith continues to cast over 2.5 centuries on economic debates into our own time, the truly impressive achievement of Jerry's book is to lay out crisply, clearly, and forcefully what Smith actually believed, so that no matter what spot one occupies on the contemporary political spectrum, Jerry enables his readers to know more assuredly how to debate the merits of that influence. In scale and in ambition, Jerry's most widely acclaimed book is undoubtedly The Mind and the Market, in which his aptitude for both exposition and analysis are most manifestly on display, as is his erudition. And here I can only repeat what was also said about that book, that is, the adjective magisterial may well have been invented to describe that volume. By contrast, Capitalism and the Jews consists of 4 small gems, essays that reflect upon the equivocal role that European Jews, mostly, have played in economic history from the Middle Ages to the 20th century. Disproportionately resourceful in the creation of private wealth, and Jerry conjectures why, and yet also notoriously targeted by the resentful and the envious. From the synoptic assurance of The Mind and the Market to the insights that are sprinkled through Capitalism and the Jews, these books demonstrate a curiosity and a virtuosity sustained over the course of a lifetime. And when I consider his articles and book reviews as well, his willingness to praise the works of others should be underscored. Jerry is hardly lacking in critical powers, but they have been enlisted not only to locate the missteps of others, but also to draw attention to authors who, in his opinion, have been underappreciated, or who have been honored for the wrong reasons. Here I am thinking of Jerry's discriminating assessments of Philip Reif, of Stephen T. Katz, of Peter Berger, plus his public defense at a conference at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum of Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, who had been misleadingly accused of disrespect for the tremendum of the Shoah itself. Were I, as a colleague, to stand on one foot and to summarize the major themes of Jerry's scholarship, it would be the focus on certain isms: capitalism, nationalism, conservatism, socialism, totalitarianism, and how, from a conservative perspective, some isms don't become wasms, but extend from past to present. And may I highlight Jerry's wit as well. He is one of the funniest people I know, with a well-developed gift for detecting human folly. His comic stance is wry rather than malicious, jolly rather than rancid. The bite and pungency of his observations, which have enlivened so many of our conversations, whether by phone or in person, therefore belies the reputation of his native Canada for being uninteresting. When the Canadian novelist Mordecai Richler wanted to come up with a title that was least likely to be checked out of a public library in the United States, it was the title Canada, Our Friendly Neighbor to the North. And a mild sample of Jerry's wit comes at the very end of Adam Smith in His Time and Ours, in which the author reveals his family's business success by writing. Contrary to one of the most famous aphorisms of The Wealth of Nations, I have long benefited from the benevolence of butchers and would like to thank the Vice President and the Secretary Treasurer of Muller's Meats Limited, and above all, its president, who taught me a good deal about commercial society, though he doesn't know Smith from Adam, end of quote. Michael Kimmage did not ask me to serve as a character witness, but I must finally mention that among Jerry's finest qualities is his loyalty. This virtue is not especially prized in the Academy, whose members are often whipsawed between various allegiances and jealousies. But throughout his adult life, Jerry has exhibited extraordinary and abiding loyalty to his family, to his friends, if I may say so, to his faith, as well as evidently to the Catholic University of America. The enduring love that he and Sharon have for one another radiates outward into widening concentric circles and testifies to the devotion that bridges generations and defies geography. To catch Jerry weeping at what seems to be the numerous celebrations that punctuate the calendar of the remarkable Muller family is to sense the depth of his feelings for his loved ones and to gauge how much they have mattered to him. Speaking for myself, I have cherished for so many decades the amplitude and generosity of his friendship. I am therefore pleased to honor Jerry's retirement this afternoon.
Well, thank you so much, Steve. It's sort of difficult to follow those beautiful words, and probably more difficult for Jerry to respond to them than to the somewhat more formal statements about his scholarship. Nevertheless, we do have a good 10 minutes on the panel, and I would hate to convene a group of these figures and not use every minute of the time that we have available to us. So, I'll pass the microphone to Jerry in just a moment, but if we're lacking for a topic to go into a little further, I was struck in your comments by the geography of Jerry's career. Steve, you mentioned Canada at the end of your remarks. Steve Whitfield, Stephen Aschheim, you mentioned time that Jerry has spent in Israel, which I know has been very consequential. And of course, much of Jerry's scholarship has concerned Europe and the United States. So perhaps that's something that we could reflect on, this very cosmopolitan career, and not only thematically rich and diverse and complicated, but sort of geographically, or if one wishes to say civilizationally. But Jerry, let me pass the microphone over to you if you have any comments or questions for your friends on this panel, and if not, we'll find some on your behalf.
Well, first of all, I'm very grateful to Steve and Jerry and Steve for those kind reminiscences and evaluations. What more could I ask for? I'll only say in response that I don't remember being that conservative when I was an undergraduate, and I'm not that unequivocally conservative now. I was just more conservative then than the dominant spirit of the time, certainly at Brandeis, as Jerry Izenberg indicated. And I guess I'm in many ways a political centrist, which makes me on the far right in the humanities and social sciences. So some of this conservatism is dispositional, but some of it is relative as well. I should also say that in regard to Steve Aschheim's remembrance of the apartment that he lent to Sharon and I at a key point in our relationship. Not only was it good for our relationship, but while I was there, I picked up a book off his shelf by Isaiah Berlin called, I think it was then called 3 Essays on Liberty. This was in the pre-inflationary era. It's now up to 4. And I think it was the first serious work of political thought that I read. I had read Marcuse as an undergraduate, but that doesn't quite, as a high school student, but that doesn't quite count. And not only was it one of the first books of political theory that I read, but it was one of the most influential books of political theory on my own worldview that I had read in terms of the discussions of pluralism and so on. So I'm grateful to him for that too.
So, Stephen, I suppose you were right that if they weren't quite discussing Dostoevsky, they were discussing Isaiah Berlin. So it's very good to have the historical record set straight on that point. On the subject of humor, I can't resist, mentioning a future publications of Jerry's, or at least it's sort of there to be considered on the resume. The title of which is Planned Grandparenthood. Now, I'm sure that there's a perfectly legitimate academic meaning to the title, but I can't, I couldn't resist a smile when I saw it, in part because it's just funny for what it is, but it's also funny knowing how the title sounds when you hear it in Jerry's voice, and exactly those humorous qualities, Steve Whitfield, that you described a moment ago, sort of resonate even in that very brief title. Stephen Aschheim, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just want to say to Jerry, I've been searching for that book, the 3 Essays on Liberty, for the last 40 years.
Okay, I actually didn't type it, but there you go. It seems that there's a question in the chat. Michael, do you want to read
Oh,
it?
is that right? I didn't quite catch that. And Jerry, did you have your, is it a question? Okay, in the chat, not in the. Okay, this is from Sam Moyne. Wonderful panel. Thank you for everything. What a generous colleague to his elders and juniors Jerry has been, and his geniality always outranks any differences with interlocutors further left or further right. What a treasure he has been, in the grandparenting and Taubes books, however different, will both be excellent. So it's not a question, but it's a comment, and I think very, very nice to get, because it's so much in the spirit of student teacher reminiscence. Steve Whitfield.
Yes, just a serious question, since I think all 3 of the participants in this panel were struck by Jerry's precocity. So I'm just wondering, Jerry, other than Sir Isaiah Berlin, were there any books that you as a teenager or late teenager or early 20s, do you think especially shaped your thinking?
When I was a high school student, when I was about 16, I met the only intellectual who I would personally meet, who then appeared in The Mind and the Market. And he also later appears in the Taubes book, and that is Herbert Marcuse. When I was about 16, I was quite 16 or 17, I was quite taken with him. And I wrote a paper about him in a history class in Niagara Falls. And then one day I ventured to Toronto to go hear him speak at what was then, I think, O'Keefe Center in a huge auditorium. Afterwards, and this was a sign of sort of my precocity or my chutzpah, depending on how you look at it, I went behind stage and talked to him and saw him smoking a big cigar and so on. And he was very genial and so on. And although I've had many disagreements with the substance of some of his thought and substance of some of his political positions, one of his key insights, which I've repeated in The Mind and the Market, both in the Marcuse chapter and after, was that people should be aware that there are people and companies in the market that are trying to sell you things that you don't need, and in the quest for which you might end up devoting your time to matters that are far less creative and rewarding than they could otherwise be. And as I say, although I disagree with him on many, many other things, that has been an enduring, repeated theme in my work and also in my life.
I don't want to neglect the comment that came in on the chat, but an informative book in Jerry's intellectual development was Steal This Book, from which that comes from David Muller and must explain Jerry's great interest in Proudhon's idea that property is theft, which is another of the themes that's sort of overarching throughout Jerry's scholarship.
That was, for those of you who are too young to remember, which is most of you, that was a book by Abby Hoffman. The first political donation I ever made was to the Chicago 7, which involved Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman and a number of others. All of this probably alludes to the fact that I probably had a great advantage in going through the period of leftist radicalism while I was between the ages of about 15 to 17, and then having gotten over it by the time I got to college. Yeah. And in regard to Sam Moyne's comment, I should say about Sam Moyne, he's also a student of Jerry Izenberg's, albeit at a later stage. And he's one of those people who I respect and love to argue with.
Jerry, did you have your hand up a moment ago, please?
Just apropos of that, Jerry, I quite agree with you. You're not as conservative as people make you out to be or whatever. Classical liberal is the way I tend to think of you rather than conservative. But it's all relative. And the fact is that you are a maverick against the mainstream of the academy in many ways. And that's been part of your great strength. And I think we should all appreciate that. Anyone who knows where intellectual history in the current American Academy is, knows that Jerry is part of, or not part of, what I would call the compact majority, to use Hendrik Ibsen's term. He's in many ways against the mainstream, and that's precisely what a great deal of his strength has been.
Well, of course, we know Jerry at Catholic University as an Enlightenment radical, so I couldn't agree more, Jerry, with your sense of Jerry Muller as a thinker who strikes out to his own lights and keeps true to them. I don't think that we have a great deal more time. I certainly wouldn't want to overlook any kind of concluding comments. Stephen Aschheim, Steve Whitfield, any concluding thoughts before we go to our next break and prepare for the next panel?
I'll just say this, the thought has just struck me now. I mean, unlike the other participants, I find giving compliments to Jerry a very, very difficult thing to do because that's not our mode of communication. But every word that has been said has been dead right. And risking sentimentality, I have to support that. But the thing that just occurred to me now is that my field is German and Jewish intellectual history. And when I speak to Jerry, whether it be on Jewish history, matters Israeli, Zionist, or even German history, it just struck me now that I think, and even then it's not a book of Jewish intellectual history. All your books have been other than my field. The book on Frye is certainly not Jewish history. Perhaps Taubes is, but capitalism, and nobody, I think, unless I missed it, has spoken about the book that really shocked me. What on earth are you doing with metrics? And suddenly Jerry Muller's writing a book about metrics. So what I'm trying to say is that from very, very provincial beginnings at the Institute where you began, you really have rounded yourself in a highly cosmopolitan way that I envy.
Steve Whitfield, any final comments? Or well, wonderful. Thank you so much to our three panelists for such a rich and unsentimental, but at the same time beautiful portrait of your relationships with Jerry. We'll take another 15-minute break. Let me just mention the speakers and subject of the next panel, which will begin. We're not going to take a 15-minute break. Please excuse my misreading of the program. Let me just sort of pause for a moment, and then I'll begin with the introduction to the next panel. But thank you so much to our panelists from the second panel for all that you've added to today's conversation. And I'll ask the panelists from our next panel to turn on their cameras, if not their microphones quite yet. And we'll ask Jerry, if he doesn't mind, to sort of keep on the screen. Although if you need to turn your camera off for a moment or two, Jerry, it's of course just fine. Our next panel is going to take up the subject, sort of slides very naturally from the second panel of Jerry Muller as teacher and colleague. And this will consist of 4 presentations, starting with Carl Ashley, and I'll introduce all of the panelists. We'll introduce them all now, and then we'll go in this order. Carl Ashley received his Ph.D. from the Catholic University of America in 2003 with a dissertation on Raymond Aron and study of international relations directed by Jerry Muller. Since then, he's worked at the Office of the Historian at the U.S. Department of State, where he's edited volumes of the Foreign Relations of the United States and serves as chief of the Declassification Division. Robert Townsend came to Catholic University the same year as Jerry Muller, but as a first-year student, he received his BA and MA degrees from the Catholic University of America and his PhD from George Mason University. He's been for many years deputy director of the American Historical Association and played a central role in widening and transforming its publications program. Since 2013, he's been the director of the Washington office of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Tommy Patteson holds an MA and PhD degree from Catholic University. His dissertation entitled Coming to Terms with Complexity, a Lens for the Human Sciences in the 20th Century was completed under Jerry Muller's direction in 2019. That's a very recent student of Jerry's, which is delightful. And Ernest Suarez is David M. O'Connell Professor of English and Chair of the Department of English here at Catholic University. He's also Executive Director of the Association of Literary Scholars, Critics, and Writers. And Caroline Sherman is an intellectual historian of early modern Europe. She's currently Associate Professor of History and Associate Dean for Faculty of Arts and Sciences. In 2017, she won the Provost's Award for Excellence in Early Career Teaching. During the fall of 2012, she co-taught with Jerry Muller History 601, the introductory seminar for graduate students in history. So we're delighted to have this group of people who are all in one way or another affiliated with Catholic University, and of course with Jerry's career as colleague and student. And so Carl, Ashley will begin with your thoughts.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Sweet. Well, thank you so much for having me to this. I'm really honored to be a part of it and to be here with so many of the distinguished speakers, and also with some old friends and colleagues. First, let me add my congratulations to Jerry on an outstanding career and a job well done, and a well-earned retirement. Although I hope and sure that we'll hear more from you. It was more than a year ago now when I got a note from Professor Kimmage asking if I might be willing to participate in this and say a few words about what it was like to be Jerry's graduate student. And I thought to myself, yes, someone has finally asked me to speak on a topic that I know something about. I arrived at Catholic in August 1996, and for the better part of 7 years, I worked very closely with Jerry on a Ph.D. in European intellectual history. It was my intention in those days to seek a teaching position and spend my career forcing graduate students to read Hegel. But as it turned out, I've spent the last 16 years in government in the office of the historian at the Department of State, and it's a job that I've enjoyed very much. But thinking back on my years at Catholic and reflecting on the question of what it was like to be Jerry's student, one thing immediately came to mind, and I don't know if this occurred to anyone else on this panel, but it was a lot of work. I can still remember the first meeting we had that summer, 25 years ago, after I'd been accepted to the program. The first thing Jerry did was try to talk me out of pursuing a doctorate, giving me absolutely honest and realistic expectations for my prospects for forcing graduate students to read Hegel. But having convinced him, I guess, that I intended to go through with it regardless, he began to describe for me what would be the process. I would have to take a number of classes. I'd have to read a lot of books. I'd have to write a lot of papers. I'd have to work really hard. And after about 5 years or thereabouts, we could start talking about a dissertation. 5 years. At that point, he handed over a list of journals that I was to read regularly. I'm just going to, for the sake of transparency, read a few of the titles. On the list were the American Historical Review, the Journal of Modern European History, History and Theory, Central European History, Foreign Affairs, Diplomatic History, International Security, Slavic Studies, the Time Literary Supplement, the New York Times on Sunday, and for good measure, the Frankfurt Allgemeine Zeitung. I wasn't required to read The Nation, and I'm thankful for that. But I calculated that I read something more than 120 books per year for those 7 years. And by the time I made it through, it occurred to me that earning a doctorate may be the only form of medieval torture to survive into the 21st century. So it was a lot of work, but on the other hand, it was also the most intellectually rewarding time of my life by far. Jerry is every bit as committed to excellence in teaching as he is to excellence in scholarship. He took me on as a student, and having made that commitment, worked very hard to make sure I got the best education he could provide. There were many hours in his office discussing everything from the Scottish Enlightenment to the history of capitalism, every significant thinker from Hobbes to Marx to Hayek, German radical conservatism to the Frankfurt School, and everything in between, and so much more. And it was exciting to attend his classes, not only because we were treated to an endless stream of new ideas and insights, but you also knew that you were getting the best possible analysis of the issues at hand. I don't think I left a class or a meeting with Jerry without having learned something new or learned to appreciate an issue from a new and more important perspective. I could mention a number of examples of this, but I'm going to mention one class in particular because I can't forget it. It's etched into my brain. An intellectual history course on none other than our friend, the 19th century German historian Hegel. Such a course on Hegel does not typically draw huge crowds. And when it turned out that I was the only one enrolled in this course, Jerry decided to go ahead with it on my behalf alone. And we spent the entire semester reading one book, Hegel's Philosophy of Right, along with a stack of associated commentary text. This was not easy reading. Most weeks we met in Jerry's home office in his basement, me across the desk from him. And in that situation, there's nowhere to hide. I actually had to read all those books and be ready. But Jerry read them along with me, guiding me through that dense textual forest with a heroic patience. Thinking back on it, I have to wonder if this was the best use of his time. But for me, it was an extraordinary, unique, and unparalleled academic experience. I emerged from Jerry's tutelage with an excellent education, and one that I would stack up against that of anyone that I've met since, no matter where they went to school. But apart from the intellectual growth, I also learned many other valuable lessons, and I'm talking here about scholarly professionalism and especially integrity. Indeed, you couldn't spend 7 years with Jerry without developing a tremendous respect for his integrity as a scholar. One of the things that I came to admire most was his unshakable practice of standing his ground and advocating his case despite some vigorous pushback. And I do recall witnessing some rowdy exchanges at department symposia. But whether you agree with him or not, there's no question that he's done his homework and arrived at his conclusions through the most rigorous scholarly methods. And the lessons I learned on that front have served me well in government. Jerry taught me that when you enter the ring, you must be prepared. Know your facts, make your case, advocate forcefully, be fair, but above all, be absolutely honest. It was a tremendous and wonderful privilege for me to spend those years at Catholic with Jerry. And I left Catholic in 2003, having learned everything that I came to learn. It's an experience that I will forever hold dear. And I mean that very sincerely. And even on those occasions now that are all too frequent, when the world seems like it's going off the rail, I pull one or another of Jerry's books off the shelf, and it always puts my head back on straight. And although I haven't produced much of my own scholarship, I have participated in the publication of more than 70 of these large red volumes of the Foreign Relations series, available for a small fee at the US government printing office. And I have enjoyed that job very much. And I've also got to do some other fun things I didn't expect, like work for my friend and colleague, Robert Townsend at the American Historical Association. But to return to the original question, what was Jerry like as a teacher? I think maybe the best evidence of his skill as a teacher is the fact that he could take a kid like me who grew up on the railroad tracks in West Virginia and train him up to the point where he could be a historian at the Department of State. It's far more than I ever imagined. And I owe so much of that to Jerry's mentorship. So I thank you, Jerry. I'm very grateful for the valuable time I had with you at Catholic. Congratulations on your retirement, and I wish you the very best.
Thank you, Carl. That was lovely. Well worth the time we spent together.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl. Your reference to rowdy exchanges at department colloquia reminds me that Jerry hasn't been to a colloquium for a while, and we'll have to hook him back into one as soon as possible, because who would want a colloquium without a rowdy intellectual exchange? Thank you so much, Carl, for all of those comments. Let's turn now to Robert Townsend and to his comments.
Thanks so much. I'm delighted to be here at this, well, perhaps not delighted at the idea that Jerry is ending his teaching career, but I'm delighted to be here nonetheless to sing his praises. And I was sort of struggling to imagine what I would say about somebody I've now known for more than 35 years. And both my first year in college and his first year at CUA. And so I thought the best way of getting to that would be to go back to the notes that I had from the various classes that I took with Jerry, and which I found both an enriching and a very humbling experience, and particularly to see the rather shapeless clay he had to deal with back 36 years ago. And my first class with Jerry came when I was a very conservative, I will admit this, Reagan Republican in the politics department at CUA. And the distribution requirements forced me into the World in the 20th Century course, which Jerry was teaching along with Nelson Lichtenstein, an American labor historian, which was everything you might imagine. And I can still remember a class in February of 1985 when Nelson was lecturing about post-war Japan and spent much of his time lavishing praise on their industrial policy as the ideal economic model for the future. I spent much of that class fuming in my seat, as you might imagine, and was sort of struggling with sort of what I might say. But before I had an opportunity, Jerry popped up in the back of the class to respond firmly, but politely, with a few thoughts of his own about, or at least to raise some questions about it. And Jerry then proceeded to carry that argument over to the next class that he taught 2 weeks later, which was about post-war China, I think, which, according to my notes, a good portion of which was taken up with a discussion of the problems with the socialist economy. So needless to say, it was a fun and thrilling, and I felt very connecting time for the teacher-student experience. But as you might imagine, feeling a keen ideological affinity for Jerry's take up that day was not sufficient for success as a student. And I went back and I found my first midterm, which was 2 weeks after that, where Jerry gave me a B- with the admonition that I was only supposed to answer one of the questions that was offered as one of the essay questions. So there you go. It speaks to one of the added benefits of having Jerry as a teacher, which is he was one of the very few teachers I could not BS my way through a class with. And with Jerry, an essay always needed to have the fundamentals right, but more than that, they needed to articulate the point in a coherent and jargon-free way, all the hallmarks we've come to know in his writing through the years. Nevertheless, despite some of the challenges, I did get an A in that class to wrap it up, I believe. I changed majors and dedicated as many credit hours as possible to Jerry's classes, which, even as an undergraduate, as Carl sort of alluded to, was no small task. In my sophomore year, I took 2 classes with Jerry, which meant reading 2 books and writing 2 3-page papers a week, which I gather is not the norm for undergraduate history education these days. But those Thursday classes where I could go from capitalism to Western European intellectual history were certainly the kinds of challenging intellectual feasts that make one wish they could be back in school. And even where he might have agreed with the endpoint of some of my analyses, that was never sufficient. He would always push me to do more, to think about my premises, and to back it with clear and convincing evidence. And he was there to press me to be a better writer as well. In 1986, for instance, I developed an enthusiasm for terms such as reify and Weltanschauung, which thankfully Jerry cured me of, and at least made me a bit more cautious about introducing such sins into future writing. And in my current work, I find it striking that relatively few humanities majors report that they see a relationship between their studies and their jobs. At least from Jerry's classes, the honing and sharpening of my intellectual and writing tools into the capacities I still use today seem immediate and obvious to me. And in terms of life-changing advice, one of those other aspects that one thinks of from a great teacher, few come close to Jerry's recommendation in my second year of graduate school, when my wife was expecting our first child. He observed that my job at the American Historical Association seemed more likely to provide for a growing family, with certainly more than another 4 years in graduate schools, which I like to believe reflects Jerry's deep and abiding belief in family rather than his perceptions of my abilities as a scholar at the time. But it fundamentally changed the trajectory of my life in ways that I've never come to regret, especially since I spent much of the 90s writing about a crisis in the job market for history PhDs, a rather modest crisis at the time relative to today. And perhaps more importantly, as someone who spent a career in nonprofit management, Jerry's keen sensitivity to intellectual systems and organizational behavior prepared me as few things could for the path I ended up on. Few things can prepare you, I think, for a life in the academic bureaucracy, as many hours of deep reading in Smith, Weber, Schumpeter, and others for Jerry's classes. It was a master class, even if young me didn't recognize it, in the role of institutions in society and the traditions and ideas that shape them. And even when I returned to college 20 years ago to finally earn a PhD, those same lessons kept returning as I tried to write a positive analysis about professionalization at a time when much of academia seemed to hold the idea in contempt. And of course, leaving the department does not end the life of learning one gets from Jerry. He has always been generous with his time, and I can look forward to catching up with him over lunch once or twice a year and adding to my list of recommended readings in intellectual history, as well as the excellent movies and TV shows that he is always there to recommend. And how he manages to do both the writing and the TV shows, I will never understand. And of course, I still learn a great deal just by keeping up with Jerry's published output as well. Though if Peter is still here, I have to say, it takes no small amount of courage to stand on a metro platform in the subway system of Washington with a brightly yellowed book called Capitalism and the Jews. Although maybe today I would receive more appreciative glances from that, obviously for the same wrong reasons. But it does break my heart to think that Jerry's time as a teacher has ended so prematurely. Though I have to say, if it means more books for those of us in his ardent fan base, I can only say hurrah, particularly as I'm about to join him in grandparenthood. So Jerry, I do hope you will get cracking on that next book soon. And until then, I'm proud to be here to join your other friends and colleagues who have benefited from your work at CUA over the past 35 years, and to thank you for all you did to set me on the path I am today. So thank you, Jerry.
Thank you, Robert. And Robert's one of those people from where I've profited from talking to them about the various organizations they've been involved in, which have also given me a lot of clues and insights into organizational dynamics. And I'm thrilled to hear you're about to become a grandparent.
Thank you so much, Robert. Let's turn to Tommy Patteson now.
Okay, can everybody hear me? So I'd second everything that Carl and Robert said, and I appreciate all the panelists so far, and certainly I'm looking forward to the grand finale from Dr. Muller. I did something a little bit different, so I'll just jump right in. Warren Buffett's right-hand man, Charlie Munger, has a book titled Poor Charlie's Almanac. In it, Munger discusses certain human tendencies or weaknesses that one needs to be aware of to avoid folly and to be successful in life. To understand and remedy these human tendencies, Munger tries to combine what he thinks of his worldly wisdom from practical experience, as well as his study of the social sciences. My view as a student of Jerry Muller has been that he has tried to do the same thing. He has tried to use his worldly wisdom, whether from Muller meets or later in life, as well as his knowledge of the social sciences to combat our all too human tendencies and avoid folly even among intellectuals, as he and Professor Herf were discussing earlier in their poor political judgment, but I'm thinking it as a teaching and student perspective. So inspired by the title of Munger's book, I'll offer what I'll call Poor Jerry's Almanac, Lessons for Combating Our All Too Human Tendencies, just a list of some of the great lessons I learned from Professor Muller. Lesson 1, be candid and have high expectations. There's certainly a tendency with students today to avoid criticizing them and perhaps even coddle them too much. And this might be to maintain enrollment numbers or help with course evaluations, or maybe not to hurt students' feelings or self-esteem. And certainly for Jerry, this tendency was not good for students, and especially students like me who needed to know what was expected of them, needed to hear unpleasant feedback at times. And maybe at some point later, I can tell my first experience of that unpleasant feedback. Lesson 2, be convincible. So there's a human tendency to stick with our initial judgments about things, not change our minds. But for Jerry, it's clear that one needs to be capable of being convinced based on new evidence. And this certainly happened for me many times, but one of the most notable was with my dissertation. When I first came to him with my dissertation topic, I didn't convince him that it was a viable topic. And but I was able, he gave me a month to convince him, and I came back a month later and was able to do so. Though admittedly with her, Dr. Sherman here, she played a big role in that by chatting with me for about an hour, helping me clarify my scattered thoughts. Lesson 3, this is I'll steal a quote from Maimonides. One should accept the truth from whatever source it proceeds. Certainly a lot has been said today about Professor Muller's ability to be incisive and critical, but he's also very open to learning from people that he disagrees with, or people who have said things that are not very smart in one place or another, or people that he maybe doesn't like for one reason or another. And I learned to resist this tendency, I think at first indirectly, and in the comments for a paper that I wrote for him. I had been somewhat dismissive of a somewhat eminent scholar, but one that I was sure that he disagreed with. But nonetheless, he told me that as a young graduate student, I shouldn't be so dismissive, and I would miss out on learning a lot of important things if I did something like, if I continued to do this. Lesson 4 ties in with this: appreciate diverse perspectives. Maybe my favorite lines from all of Jerry's writing is from The Mind in the Market, which is, capitalism is too important and too complex a subject to be left to the economists. And certainly Jerry resists in his teaching and in his writing the tendency and the perils of relying too heavily on one particular lens or one perspective. And he draws on multidisciplinarity and many modes of thought in his own thinking, as well as trying to impart it to his students. Lesson 5, be impish, playful, rebellious. I'll add unfashionable based on earlier discussions, and don't forget to entertain and don't be afraid to entertain taboo ideas. Jerry's ability to do these things has been, I think, the source of many of his most creative insights. And I think another benefit of this playfulness is that it's kept him young. At no point did Professor Muller as a student seem burnt out to me. And often when I arrived to classes with him, he was the most excited and got the most genuine delight from the books that we were reading. Lesson 6, be independent-minded. I think enough has been said about Jerry's independence of mind, but I'll just add one other comment that I was recently reminded of Leszek Kolakowski's impish essay, My Correct Views on Everything, and I thought of Professor Muller. He could perhaps write an essay called My Incorrect Views on Everything, the musings of an independent mind in a world of hive mentalities, because according to one hive or another, he's always incorrect. And finally, the lesson that ties all this together, lesson number 7, is be courageous. Not too long ago, I had a conversation with an eminent scholar and cultural critic, and he asked me about Jerry, saying that based on his encounters with him, that he always found him to be very pleasant and amiable. I replied that that was true, but that he does have a pugnacious streak. He laughed when he replied and said, "Oh, I know that, but I admire that about Jerry. It has taken a lot of courage for him to take some of the positions he has, even if I don't always agree." Jerry has had the courage to use his worldly wisdom and his knowledge of social science to combat, and knowledge of other things, to combat our all too human tendencies in teaching students like me and elsewhere. He's been courageous enough to do the things that are hard and unpopular, to give tough love, to be convincible and change his mind, to be open-minded, and to learn from those he disagrees with, as well as to consider diverse perspectives. But above all, he's had the courage to remain independent-minded. With no delusions about being perfect in any of these things, Jerry Muller can honestly say he did it his way. I can't possibly describe all the ways that Professor Muller has supported and guided me. I'm sure I'm not even in any way close to being consciously aware of all the ways in which he and his work has influenced me, but I'm very grateful for all of it and everything that he's given to me. So thank you so much, Jerry. Here's to a heck of a career and to a retirement full of continued learning, writing, teaching, and most importantly, I encourage lots more mischievous behavior, especially with your grandchildren, and helping them be mischievous around their parents.
Thanks so much, Tommy. I just want to note in passing how much I learned from working with the doctoral students. I didn't have very many, but from ones that I worked with. From working with Carl, I learned a tremendous amount, not only about Raymond Aron, but about international relations during the whole Cold War period, including the Algerian War and so on. And I gather that stood him in good stead in his future career. Tommy wrote a remarkably wide-ranging dissertation about that encompasses thinkers from sociology to economics to philosophy to business theorists to cybernetic scholars. And I learned a tremendous amount from working with him, and I hope that others will learn a tremendous amount from the dissertation that he wrote, and that I hope will be published in the not too distant future.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks, Tommy. Now we sort of depart for a brief moment from the history department and cross the virtual quad over to the English department and to Ernest Suarez, and very much look forward to his remarks.
Hi, I'm very, very happy to be here, but I'm not happy that Jerry retired. And if I could have talked him out of it, I would have, but I learned about it too late. I miss him. I miss him all the time on campus, and I would have done whatever I could to have talked him out of retiring. When I arrived at Catholic University as a long-haired assistant professor in 1991, and you can tell quite a bit of time has gone by since then, Virgil Nemayanu, who was the most prominent scholar in the English department at the time, told me that two people he very much admired on campus were Robert Sokolowski in history and Jerry Muller, Robert Sokolowski in philosophy and Jerry in history. Bob Sokolowski was an internationally celebrated philosopher. Jerry was just a few years older than I was and had recently been promoted to associate professor. But Virgil was smart and had an eye for talent. Jerry became an ordinary professor in 1996, and by that point he was only in his early 40s and an internationally respected historian. And as we all know, really, I think 1996, he was just getting started. Jerry and I got to know each other gradually over the years. We sat in quite a few faculty and committee meetings together before we became more than just casual friends. But I noticed that I tended to agree with him more than with just about anyone else at the university, especially on issues involving academic standards. Academic quality and rigor were the heart of the matter for Jerry. He had and has his personal and intellectual convictions, as we all know, but he's more than ready to engage people with other opinions if, and this is an important if, he believes they possess academic integrity. And by the way, I've never thought of Jerry as conservative. I'm not conservative. I think of him as thoughtful and informed and from issue to issue being discerning. And I share with him very much the role of the humanities in education. Another thing that I also appreciate about Jerry is that he has very little patience for BS. Even when he wouldn't say anything in meetings, I could look at his face and think, okay, I'm ready to get the heck out of here too. But if the issues were engaging, he was engaged, and he was, of course, perceptive and productive in the meetings. He made me change my mind on issues now and then, though, as I mentioned, I tended to agree with him more than just about anyone else. And when it came to important matters, including cases having to do with tenure and promotion, which can be very tricky things, we tended to find ourselves on the same side, insisting on high standards and resisting what's sometimes used to euphemistically called social promotions, promotions based on years at the university rather than on scholarly production. We also challenge the university administration from time to time when we believe that its actions compromised academic integrity. Sometimes we won, sometimes we lost. But Jerry always put quality first. He was fearless, and he stressed the need to make the university better by insisting on high quality research and teaching. He took undergraduate teaching seriously, as some of you have testified to, and recognized its importance, but he believed in Catholic University's mission as a graduate research institution. Whenever I was asked to join a committee and learned that Jerry was on it, it made me more willing to participate. Jerry didn't like to waste time. He wanted to get at what was important and address it head on. And yeah, what can I say except thank goodness for that. As the years went by and our friendship grew, I also learned that Jerry wasn't just a prominent historian of capitalism and of the West and of all the other matters people have spoken about, but that he also possesses a deep aesthetic sense. He's widely read in and possesses a sophisticated understanding of art and of literature. I recall inviting my friend Rosanna Warren to campus to give a talk on William Blake. Rosanna is a superb poet and a gifted painter and teacher at the University of Chicago. I was surprised and delighted to discover that Rosanna and Jerry were friends. She still remains very fond of him, and that Jerry knew her work. All of this is to say that Jerry isn't just an insightful, reliable, brilliant historian and colleague. He's superb company. It's one of the reasons why I would have wanted to talk him out of retiring. As some of you noted, he has a great and sometimes wicked sense of humor. He makes me think, he makes me laugh, and above all, I trust him and I trust his judgment. I should add that our friendship deepened even more when Michael Kimmage came to campus. Like Jerry, Michael is brilliant, possesses a great range of knowledge, has a keen aesthetic sense, has written on literature, and a wonderful sense of humor. The three of us formed a bond almost effortlessly. We discuss sensitive issues frankly and with trust. We've enjoyed one another's company and are interested in one another's research and well-being. It's been a gift. Having Jerry as a colleague for 30 years is one of the best things that's happened to me at Catholic University and at my career. In my career, Catholic University is immensely better off for having him on our faculty for so many years. It's almost unbelievable to me that another university didn't steal him from us, in fact. I'm a better scholar in person for knowing him. I just want to thank Jerry for being Jerry. Jerry, my friend, you have made my life richer.
Thank you, Ernie. And it goes both ways, really, and entirely. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Ernie, for those many kind and of course very apt words about Jerry and his presence at Catholic University as a connecting link, as a voice of reason in the running of the university, and as such a bright intellectual light, not just for students, as we've been hearing about at the beginning of the panel, but certainly for us as Jerry's colleagues. Well, it gives me great pleasure to sort of, I don't want to quite say welcome back Caroline Sherman among the historians, but to have Caroline Sherman back among the historians, of course, she's never left, but has a dual-headed position at the moment. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Ernie, for bringing me just to the brink of tears, but not quite flicking me over the edge with that. I've known Jerry as both a teacher and a colleague. He took on the role as mentor when I first came to campus, fresh out of graduate school. As Michael mentioned, I co-taught his spectacularly conceptualized course on methodology with graduate students with him once, where I learned so much. And of course, then we were colleagues together in the history department, which I still have not left. I think what has struck me most with working with Jerry over these years has been his combination of sharp analytical insight with his decency and generosity of spirit. I'm thinking here of the mentoring lunches, the easy suggestions of people one should contact, the free sharing of ideas, the book titles. I've learned today that Jerry gets book titles from other people, but I can let you know he also passes them on. And sometimes they involve puns, but we love him anyway. As I was thinking about the kindness that Jerry has shown to me, it occurred to me that for a man whose recent work celebrates the value of human judgment, Jerry also keeps his finely tuned judgment in reasonable perspective, avoiding those pitfalls of bad judgment that have come up in a couple of our panels, which is to say, there are actually many things about which Jerry reserves or suspends judgment, as he does not have, in his judgment, reasonable or sufficient grounds with which to judge. And this is a remarkable quality, extremely useful one in his work as a teacher and a colleague. He never pursues non-judgment as a good end on its own, but he does model the best qualities through his controlled exercise of his extraordinary judgment. Perhaps as a corollary, there is the marvelous dispassion with which Jerry conducts intellectual disagreements. I'm not sure I've ever met anyone who wanted so much to hear opposing or new arguments. He would like to consider changing his mind, as Tommy pointed out. He would find it really interesting to change his mind. Another model, I think, for students and colleagues, that open engagement we could never see enough of in the academy. But as I was thinking about Jerry's many wonderful qualities, that mischievous sense of humor, it's so contextual that I'm not going to attempt to give any of his jokes new life here. His expansive curiosity, his aperçus, many of which ring in my ear to this day, his clear and brilliant writing. It occurred to me that I could end this part of the event with a crowning bit of glory for him, because I believe that I have identified the highest bit of praise that one colleague could give to another. And it is this: Jerry, I miss you at faculty meetings. And what I mean by that is this: not just Jerry's funny comments and observations about our corner of the universe, although those are missed. Not just the chit chat before the meeting begins or ends, although that is also missed. Not just the contributions and directions that helped us make good decisions, although we all miss that too. But really, Jerry, what I mean when I say that I miss you in department meetings is that I miss the way you disagreed with me. Disagreement springs eternal in the academy. It's very possible to find other interlocutors to push back on one's follies. But when Jerry disagrees with you, he does so by so astutely crystallizing the point of contention, sometimes reframing it or identifying the precise stakes, the actual ramifications of what you're proposing, that it changes the way you see the problem. It doesn't always change one's mind. It always left me able, though, maybe not at that meeting, right? I had to take some time to recover. But in a subsequent meeting, I would be able to argue my point better. And I have to say, it's really hard to imagine, Jerry, that we're ever going to argue as well without you. But I do have hope that we will have learned at least some of what you had to teach us.
Thank you. I guess I have a few minutes to make some comments, though I'm rather left breathless by what my former students and colleagues have said. let me just say a couple of things. One of the advantages of teaching at Catholic University, which I only came to appreciate over time, partly as I came to know the university better, but also as the American Academy changed, was the remarkable intellectual freedom that one had there to teach a wide variety of ideas and a wide variety of perspectives, much wider, I dare say, than is the case at many academic institutions. And I've had friends at other institutions say, oh, I could never teach a book like that. You know, wouldn't be allowed at my university. And that has been, I think it's one of the underappreciated by the administration and to some extent the faculty of Catholic University. Secondly, the fact that so often, certainly in my department and in many other departments, we really tried to hire the best person. And as I spent more and more time there, I played more and more of a role in hiring my colleagues in the department at Catholic University and then in promoting them. And there are many of them who I'm very proud to have played a role in hiring and promoting, and certainly Caroline is high among them. It's hard to find a more fruitful intellectual interlocutor, and not just on purely intellectual matters, but on matters where ideas and personal life intersect too. I think that you're right about open engagement. I am genuinely actually interested in hearing opposing ideas, and I do change my mind from time to time. And sometimes I've discussed that in class when I was teaching John Stuart Mill's on liberty. And he talks about the importance of hearing an argument in its most effective form from someone who actually believes it. I gave my students an example of how one of the many occasions when that has occurred in my own life. And I think that's important for students to hear. It's actually more important now at a time when presumed righteousness and intolerance has increased tremendously in the academy over the last year or two. My relationship with Ernie is a good example of how moving from being a faculty member to becoming a chair widened some of my relationships in the university, in getting to know people in other roles, and in seeing the university from a different perspective as a result. So all in all, and I must say that I don't really have very many regrets about retiring when I did. My one regret is Caroline and I were supposed to teach a course together on the history of the family, a course which she had been teaching for quite some time, and I was interested in getting involved in. And I retired at a time that made that impossible. So that is one of my major regrets of a decision that on the whole I have not regretted. So I'll leave it there for now.
Well, I see a elegant administrative solution to that regret, Jerry, which is that you come back in the future and teach the course with Caroline. So that's a topic that we'll return to at the very end of today's conversation, is the ongoing relationship we hope you'll still have with the history department in the university. But we have until 5 p.m. for this panel. That's sort of a good 20 minutes. I'm not sure if there's really the sort of opportunity for back and forth, sort of questions and answers in the way that there was maybe with the first panel. But let me simply open the floor to the panel itself. I don't see any questions in the question box. I'm not quite sure what questions one would have on this on this topic, but let me sort of see if anybody wants to jump in, or perhaps if you have questions for Jerry, or if Jerry has questions for us. Robert,
I guess I'd be curious, Jerry, if you could tell us how you think your pedagogy has changed over the 35 years, or has it?
I don't know. I'm not in a very good position to judge. I think I have always hoped to elicit. When it's a seminar context, be it undergraduate or graduate, to dialectically elicit arguments from the class and then respond to them in a way that leads to other questions or comments. Other than that, I'm really not sure. One thing that I learned, somewhat to my surprise, when I came to do that course that was alluded to for the teaching company, the course called Thinking About Capitalism, was that you can actually lecture in 30 minutes. That is to say, as a professor, you're acclimated to lecturing in 50-minute increments. And it turns out that you can take most of the ideas from a 50-minute lecture and present them in 30 minutes if forced to do so. Now, there's a cost to that too, because one of the advantages of actual interaction with a class is that you look at people, you see their faces, you see what sort of things are catching on and what sort of things aren't. And you can go back and make the same point in a different way or return to it or whatever. That kind of interrelationship between the speaker and the audience is something that one can't do with a pre-recorded lecture. And frankly, to be quite honest, it's why I would find the prospect of Zoom teaching very formidable. Not necessarily beyond me, but far more difficult, because that element of speaker and response, and also the element of the charisma in the speaker, is difficult to convey in a Zoom context. Other than that, one of the ways I think my pedagogy changed a bit was in History 601, which is our introductory course to modes of historical writing, right from which I taught on and off for a very long time. At first, the point of it was to show various perspectives on the writing, various ways in which historians write, and various topics, the range of things on which they write. And that continued to be the leitmotif of the course. As time went on, there are certain books, and I changed the books from time to time, but as time went on, there are certain books I kept coming back to and teaching again. Mark Bloch's book on feudal society, or Goitein's book on the medieval family, or a book by Steinberg on the sexuality of Christ in Renaissance painting and subsequent oblivion. And what happened, there's another one like that by Cronin about nature's metropolis. Over time, as I got more experience as a historian, I came to have a real awe for these books, not just the kind of appreciation and not just, demonstrating the various things that the historians were trying to convey, but the way in which a real awe at their ability to, on the one hand, immerse themselves in sources, and on the other hand, to bring a variety of perspectives, sometimes comparative perspectives, often perspectives drawn from entirely different disciplines, like anthropology in the case of Bloch and Goitein, or theology in the case of Steinberg's work on Renaissance art. In other words, there were books that I taught time and again that actually got better the more I taught them. So there was a certain appreciation for and really wonder at craft at its greatest. And I think I conveyed that to the students. I always tried to convey, what was great about a thinker, even a thinker that I thought was wrong in some important respect. But as time went on, I think my awe and reverence came through in a more, both because it was more deeply felt and because I didn't do anything to disguise it. I think that's it.
I have a question for you, Jerry, and then I'm going to ask one that's in the Q&A box. I'm curious what role Washington, D.C. played in your career, because of course, as a grad student, the winds of fortune could have taken you just about anywhere, but they happened to take you to Washington, D.C. It's in some ways, in my experience, the city, the least academic city in the world, despite the high number of Ph.D.s. It's the city where the sausage is made. It's the city of politics, in a sense, the city of institutions, and that's already come up as an aspect of your scholarship. But I'm curious how the city of Washington, of course, campus of Catholic University in the city of Washington, but how the city of Washington at large shaped your thinking and shaped your career.
That's a very good question, Michael. And the answer is hugely. I've sometimes reflected that had I gone to some university in a place like Ithaca, New York, or somewhere like that, part of what I think of as the academic archipelago, that is, many of these many universities are located in particular towns or cities in which the main thing that's going on is that university. And that leads to a kind of inward lookingness where you think academic life is everything, and the most intense arguments are about the nature of academic life or academic disciplines and so on. Coming to Washington, one of the wonderful things about it was that there were places like the German Historical Institute that brought one into contact with scholars from other local institutions and abroad, but also places like the American Enterprise Institute or Brookings or other places where there were people who were dealing in part with ideas and in part with their implementation. There are also journals that were located here, and you could speak to the editors and go to their offices and so on. And from all of those, one got some sense of how those institutions work, but above all, the sense that ideas aren't just confined to books, that in some ways they trickle up, they trickle down, they trickle across, and the institutional means by which they do that is something that I could experience in Washington, D.C. And also, conversely, because people here are concerned with things like foreign relations or intelligence gathering or economic policy or educational policy, because they have a deep and burning concern with that, it has a spillover effect, and I became concerned with those too. So more and more after my first book, which was more academic in some way, the most academic in some ways, I've always tried to write in part with an eye towards those sorts of audiences. And conversely, the existence of such people in my environment has had an influence on the kinds of things that I think and write about. So for me, at least, Washington's been great intellectually. It's also been excellent familially and so on. But it's another good thing that Catholic University has going for it, the fact that it is in a place where so much is going on.
Well, two questions from the chat. First from Peter Doherty, and I think intended for the author of The Tyranny of Metrics. And the question is whether, when you had Carl as the only student in your class, whether you graded him on a curve. And we'll let you address that in just a moment. And then another question, I think anonymously posed, is the best story about you changing your mind on an issue question, book idea.
Well, so here's this, I don't remember how I graded Carl, but as I recall, he did very well in that course. Which
I was lucky to get out of there alive, what I felt like.
Actually, I mean, some of my most intense intellectual experiences were one-on-one experiences. I'll talk about that in a little while later, but I also did a course with Tommy on Nietzsche. And I did a course previously on Adam Smith, and some of those were really particularly rewarding. So the story that I told about how I changed my mind, Michael, is as follows. One of the people who I got to know through various circles is Robert George, who's a brilliant Catholic conservative intellectual at Princeton. And Robbie was an opponent of gay marriage. This was back in the 90s. A colleague of his had whose last name is escaping me, his first name is Steve, had recently written a book in favor of gay marriage. And Robbie George gave a talk at the American Enterprise Institute in which he analyzed and criticized the argument of this book about gay marriage. And after listening to Robbie's argument, it seemed to me that the real crux of it had to do with the premise that every sexual act had to be open to the possibility of procreation, which is a good Catholic doctrine, but not one that I shared. And I figured that if someone as smart as Robbie couldn't come up with better arguments against gay marriage, I should be for it. And so since after that, I was. And I told this story often when I taught, as I say, John Stuart Mill in intellectual history courses as an example to the students, because I wanted them to see the way this process actually works, that you try to confront the best. If you have an inclination one way or another, you try to confront yourself with the best arguments against it, and then make your decision on that basis. So I know that there's been many other issues on which I've changed my mind, but that was one of the ones that was most sort of rhetorically dramatic, I think.
The question was from Joel Tybloom about changing your mind. I don't know if any of the panelists want to jump in with maybe a concluding thought or two, or if you have any questions for Jerry. Let me just open the floor to anyone who might want to jump in. Ernie, please.
I'd just like to ask Jerry, what's your next project after wrapping up this biography?
So the biography is basically wrapped up. It's now getting proofread. So there are two projects. One is there are a number of essays that I've written over the years, some of which have been published, some of which haven't, about big topics in modern history, topics that could be the subject of a book, but that I've tried to teach it at essay length, about capitalism and morality, about capitalism and the family, about conservatism, about ethnic nationalism and nationalism, about shaping population. I'll talk more about that in a little while, about religion and historical criticism of religion. So my first project, I think, is going to be to finish writing those essays and refining them and trying to publish them under hardcovers. And then I have an idea that I've discussed with some of you called Planned Grandparenthood on Thinking Transgenerationally, which is actually a book that draws upon moral philosophy and sociology and economics and some other fields that deals with the question of how to live one's life in such a way that one becomes a grandparent, and what kinds of discussions should go on within families about money and time to facilitate that. And then we'll see how the spirit moves me.
If I could just say one thing, Jerry, sometimes I felt a little guilty for directing that incredible education you gave me to government work, but it turns out that the skills that you pick up as a historian are applicable to government work, and particularly what I'm doing, declassification, and I have enjoyed it a lot. And I do very much appreciate the time you put in to get me to this point. But I haven't written a scholarly book, and maybe I will one day. anyway.
On the contrary, Carl, I've often cited you as a case when discussing, the future with potential graduate students and saying there's something to be said for getting some degree of graduate education and then going into some field where you can make use of those skills. And in many ways, given all the volumes that you've edited and your unheralded role now in declassification, I think you're doing more for historical knowledge than almost anyone else I could have produced.
Thank you.
I cite Carl for the same reason. So.
Well, I think that it's already been a very rich panel, and anybody who has a closing thought is most welcome to jump in, but I'll sort of gradually start to wrap this one up. Tommy, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I just want to say one thing is I gifted Professor Muller my a bound copy of my dissertation, and I didn't put in an inscription in it. But after hearing the story from Professor Aschheim, I think I know what I would like to write in there now.
Are you able to disclose what you'd like to write, or will that have to be declassified later?
Oh, I was going to write the same thing that he wrote in the book for Professor Aschheim. That I think it was. I hope you enjoyed me as much as I did, or something like that.
Wonderful. Well, let me just advertise what will come next, the so-called grand finale of the day's events. This will be an introduction by Provost Dominguez, Provost of Catholic University, which will be followed by a talk from Jerry titled An Intellectual's Journey, Teaching and Writing. And then I will offer a few closing comments. This will run from 5:15 to 6 p.m. So we have an extra 10 minutes for the break, but I doubt that anybody will regret having a little bit more time for the break. And if anybody wants to get a glass of something for this last part of it, and that way we can sort of simulate the reception that that we should have been having, and I think we'll have next year when these things are possible again. So on that more later. But if you want to bring a glass to the grand finale, that's more than welcome. But let me close by thanking Carl, Robert, Tommy, Ernie, and Caroline for their sort of wonderful tributes and comments. And we will return to business at 5:15 or a minute or two before 5:15 after the break.